Ladies and gentlemen, in the dark days of World War II, as Europe burned and the Luftwaffe roared across the skies, there came a moment when the balance of air power began to tilt. The German Air Force, once feared for its unmatched skill and technology, began to meet its match. And that turning point came in the form of a machine, a 440-mile-per-hour monster that roared into the heavens and changed the face of aerial warfare forever. Its name was the P-51 Mustang. This aircraft wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of American ingenuity, Allied cooperation, and the power of technological evolution. When the Mustang arrived, the air war over Europe was transformed. Germany's mighty Luftwaffe, which had once terrorized cities and convoys alike, began to crack under the relentless onslaught of these sleek, long-range fighters that could chase them anywhere, even deep into their own skies. To understand the Mustang's impact, we must first remember the peril the Allies faced before its arrival. In 1942 and early 1943, Allied bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, began flying deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. Their mission was simple yet deadly: destroy Germany's war industry from the air. But the bombers were vulnerable. Beyond the range of their escort fighters, they were sitting ducks for German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The result? Catastrophic losses. Entire bomber formations vanished over the Ruhr Valley or Berlin. Crews were lost in flames or taken prisoner. The U.S. 8th Air Force called it the Black Week, mission after mission ending in destruction. Morale sank. It seemed the dream of daylight precision bombing was doomed. Then came the Mustang. Born not in America but in Britain, its origins were unlikely. The British Air Ministry had asked North American Aviation to build P-40s for them, but the company proposed something better, a brand new design. In a stunning 117 days, the prototype took to the skies. It was elegant, fast, and maneuverable, but its first versions, using an American Allison engine, struggled at high altitudes. The magic happened when British engineers fitted it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same heart that powered the legendary Spitfire. Suddenly, the Mustang was reborn. With that combination, it could fly higher, faster, and farther than any Allied fighter before it. It could cruise over 400 miles per hour and escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a feat no other aircraft could achieve at the time. Imagine being a German pilot in 1944. For years, you fought bombers knowing that once they reached a certain distance, their fighter escorts had to turn back. That was your chance, your hunting ground. But now, the Mustangs didn't leave. They stayed. They were there over Hamburg, over Leipzig, even over Berlin itself, and they were hunting you. The Mustang pilots, young, daring, and determined, became the spearhead of Allied air supremacy. They didn't just guard the bombers. They went on the offensive, tearing into Luftwaffe formations, destroying airfields, strafing trains, and hunting anything that moved. In dogfights, the P-51 outclimbed, outturned, and outran nearly every German fighter. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were formidable, but against the Mustang's speed and range, they were forced into a defensive war. Even the introduction of Germany's revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter, the world's first operational jet, couldn't restore the balance. The Me-262 was faster, yes, but the Mustangs could attack it during takeoff and landing when it was most vulnerable. The result was devastating. By mid-1944, the once dominant Luftwaffe was bleeding out. Their fuel supplies were crippled by bombing. Their training programs were collapsing. Their skies, once their proud domain, now belonged to the Allies. The P-51 Mustang was not the only reason, but it was the blade that made the final cut. German pilots who survived the war later spoke with a kind of grudging admiration for the Mustang. They called it the best propeller-driven fighter of the war. And they were right. But beyond the statistics, the 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed, the 15,000 Mustangs built, the legendary aces who flew them. The real story of the Mustang is one of collaboration and vision. It's a story of how nations working together could outthink and outbuild even the most advanced enemies. American manufacturing, British engineering, and the courage of thousands of airmen combined to forge something greater than any one of them alone could have achieved. And what did it achieve? It gave the Allies complete air superiority, the key to D-Day, to the bombing campaigns, and ultimately to victory in Europe. When the P-51s roamed the skies, Allied bombers struck targets with precision. Tanks moved without fear of air attack. Soldiers on the ground looked up and saw friendly wings. The air had turned from a nightmare into a fortress. The Mustang also changed the psychology of air warfare. For years, German pilots had believed themselves invincible, heirs to the legacy of the Red Baron. But as the Mustangs arrived, their confidence faltered. Every mission became a fight for survival. Every airfield became a graveyard of twisted metal. The Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility cracked, not from propaganda, but from cold, hard defeat in the skies. And perhaps most powerfully, the Mustang represented what total war demanded, not just courage, but adaptation. The Allies didn't simply build more planes, they built better ones. They listened, learned, innovated, and refined. In the Mustang, that spirit of continuous improvement soared higher than ever before. When World War II ended, the P-51 remained a symbol of victory. Even as jet age dawned, it continued to serve with distinction in Korea and beyond. Pilots loved it for its grace, engineers admired it for its efficiency, and historians remember it as the aircraft that broke the Luftwaffe's back. So, when we speak of the 400-mile-per-hour monster that cracked Germany's Air Force, we're not just describing a machine. We're honoring a triumph of intellect, unity, and will. The Mustang was more than wings and metal. It was the embodiment of Allied resilience and resolve. It proved that technology, when guided by purpose and passion, can shape the course of history. It proved that speed and range could be as decisive as bullets and bombs. And it proved, most of all, that even in the darkest skies of war, innovation can shine brighter than fear. The Mustang was the predator that hunted the hunters, the guardian angel of the bombers, and the nightmare of the Luftwaffe. It didn't just fly at 440 miles per hour. It flew into legend. Thank you. In the early years of World War II, the skies over Europe belonged to Germany. The Luftwaffe had carved its legend in fire and thunder, sweeping across Poland, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying precision. Its pilots were seasoned, its aircraft formidable, and its organization unmatched. When the United States entered the war, the Allies were already facing a grim reality. They needed not only men and machines, but something far greater, a way to challenge Germany's mastery of the air. And out of that urgent need, born from desperation and refined by ingenuity, rose a machine that would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. The P-51 Mustang. The story of the Mustang's creation is not merely a tale of technology. It is a story of problem-solving, collaboration, and courage under pressure. In 1940, the British were desperate for fighters. The Royal Air Force had barely survived the Battle of Britain and urgently needed new aircraft to sustain its fight against the Luftwaffe. They turned to American industry, requesting that North American Aviation build P-40 Warhawks under license. But the company, led by visionary engineer James Dutch Kindleberger and his chief designer Edgar Schmood, had a bold idea. Rather than produce an older design, they proposed to build an entirely new aircraft, one that could outperform anything currently in the sky. The British agreed, but there was a catch. They wanted a prototype in the air within 4 months. What followed was one of the most extraordinary feats of wartime engineering. Working under immense pressure, the North American team designed and built the prototype, designated NA-73X, in just 117 days. Every detail of the aircraft reflected cutting-edge thinking. Schmood introduced a laminar flow wing, an aerodynamic innovation that reduced drag and increased efficiency. The airframe was sleek and elegant, designed to slip through the air with minimal resistance. Even the cockpit was positioned for excellent visibility, giving pilots an unprecedented view during combat. When the prototype took its first flight on October 26, 1940, test pilots immediately sensed they had something special on their hands. It was fast, agile, and remarkably stable. However, the Mustang's early versions, powered by the American Allison V1710 engine, revealed a crucial limitation. While the aircraft performed beautifully at low altitudes, its power dropped sharply at higher ones. This was a major flaw for a fighter intended to escort bombers or engage enemies in Europe's upper skies. At that time, air battles often occurred above 20,000 feet, and at those altitudes, the early Mustangs struggled. So while the RAF appreciated the aircraft's performance for reconnaissance and low-level ground attack missions, it was not yet the high-altitude escort fighter that the Allies desperately needed. The transformation came through a remarkable act of transatlantic cooperation. British engineers, ever inventive, recognized the potential of combining the Mustang's superb airframe with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that had carried the Spitfire and Hurricane to glory during the Battle of Britain. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger gave it tremendous high-altitude performance, precisely what the Mustang lacked. In 1942, British test pilots fitted the Mustang with a Merlin engine, and the results were revolutionary. The aircraft's speed leapt beyond 430 miles per hour, and it could now climb with the best of them. The once limited fighter had evolved into a predator of the upper atmosphere. When American engineers at Packard began producing the Merlin under license, the transformation was complete. The new version, the P-51B and later P-51D, represented the perfect marriage of American design and British engineering excellence. It could fly faster, higher, and farther than any Allied fighter before it, capable of reaching deep into German territory and still having the fuel to fight and return home. For the first time, the Allies had a fighter that could escort their heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back again. This development came not a moment too soon. By 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force had begun its daylight bombing campaign over occupied Europe. The theory was sound. Precision bombing during the day would destroy Germany's industrial heart and cripple its war effort. But there was a fatal flaw. The bombers could only be escorted partway. Existing fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning lacked the range to accompany the bombers deep into enemy territory. Beyond their escort range, the bomber formations were exposed, and the Luftwaffe pounced with deadly efficiency. Entire squadrons were wiped from the skies. Missions over Schweinfurt and Regensburg turned into massacres, with dozens of bombers lost in a single raid. The sight of burning fortresses falling from the heavens became a grim reminder that without long-range protection, the bombing campaign might fail altogether. The Allies needed an escort fighter that could go the distance, and that aircraft arrived in the form of the newly Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang. The first Mustangs to enter combat in Europe quickly demonstrated their superiority. They could cruise with bombers at high altitude and then peel away to engage German fighters head-on. Their combination of range, speed, and agility was unmatched. Luftwaffe pilots who had once mocked American bombers as flying barns found themselves facing sleek, silver fighters that could chase them down across the sky. The Mustang's 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower, and its speed, over 440 miles per hour, made it capable of outpacing even the feared Focke-Wulf 190. But the Mustang's creation was more than just an engineering success. It was a reflection of wartime adaptability. The Allies learned to recognize failure and turn it into progress. The early shortcomings of the Allison engine did not end the Mustang's story. They became the catalyst for its evolution. This spirit of experimentation and cross-national collaboration was exactly what set the Allied industrial effort apart from its Axis opponents. Where the Germans clung to perfectionism and production bottlenecks, the Allies embraced practicality, flexibility, and constant improvement. In factories across the United States, the Mustang became a symbol of American industrial power. Built in huge numbers and shipped across the Atlantic, it represented the combined might of democracy and determination. Pilots trained tirelessly to master its speed and responsiveness. They knew that every flight into enemy territory was a test of man and machine. And with the Mustang, they finally had a weapon worthy of their courage. The pilots themselves often spoke of the aircraft as if it were alive, an extension of their own instincts. Its controls were light and perfectly balanced. It could roll, climb, and dive with a grace that few aircraft could match. It was fast enough to chase, yet forgiving enough to land even with damage. Many called it the Cadillac of the skies. One pilot, after his first combat mission, famously said, "I feel sorry for anyone who has to fight us now." The Mustang's creation also revealed something deeper about the Allied war effort: the willingness to share ideas and resources across borders. It was not a purely American invention, nor a purely British one, but a hybrid born of necessity and trust. The British brought the Merlin, the Americans brought the manufacturing muscle, and together they created an aircraft that neither could have built alone in time. In this sense, the Mustang stood as a symbol of Allied unity, proof that cooperation, even under pressure, could yield miracles. By the time the P-51D model appeared, with its signature bubble canopy offering panoramic visibility, it was clear that the Allies had achieved air superiority in design as well as in combat. Its range of nearly 1,600 miles with drop tanks allowed it to reach targets no other fighter could escort. It could loiter over enemy airfields, attack trains and convoys, and provide close support to ground forces. It became not just a guardian of bombers, but a relentless hunter of the Luftwaffe. Behind the polished metal and roaring engines, however, was the spirit of those who refused to accept defeat. Engineers who worked sleepless nights, pilots who pushed their machines to the limit, and commanders who gambled on innovation, all played their part in bringing the Mustang from blueprint to battlefield. In every rivet and curve of the P-51 was a story of trial, error, and triumph. The birth of the Mustang also signified the shift from reactive defense to proactive dominance. Before its arrival, the Allies fought to survive German attacks. After it, they fought to conquer the skies. It gave them not just a tool, but a psychological edge. For the first time, bomber crews could look out from their formation and see friendly fighters flying beside them all the way home. It meant protection, hope, and confidence. For the Luftwaffe, it meant the beginning of the end. Every war produces its icons, symbols that define the era and the spirit of those who fought. The P-51 Mustang was one such symbol. Its creation represented what happens when innovation is born of necessity, when nations collaborate instead of compete, and when the boundaries of possibility are pushed by urgency and imagination. It showed that even in the darkest days of conflict, the human drive to invent and improve could light the way forward. From a rushed design in a California workshop to the skies over Berlin, the Mustang's journey was nothing short of extraordinary. It was a triumph not only of engineering, but of will. A machine that began as an act of desperation and ended as an instrument of domination. When it first took flight, few could have guessed it would change the course of the air war and become a legend, whispered by both its pilots and its enemies. It is often said that wars are not won by machines alone, but by the minds and hearts that build them. The Mustang was proof of that truth. It was not just metal and fuel. It was the embodiment of resolve, creativity, and faith in the power of progress. It was born out of fear, refined by intellect, and perfected through collaboration. A true 440-mile-per-hour miracle that reshaped the skies and cracked the iron grip of Germany's air supremacy. There are moments in history when the balance of power shifts, not because of sheer numbers or brute force, but because of a single innovation that changes everything. During World War II, the air war over Europe was one such arena of transformation. For years, Germany's Luftwaffe ruled the skies with confidence and deadly skill. Its pilots were battle-hardened, its aircraft world-class, and its tactics proven. The Allies fought valiantly, but they often paid a heavy price in men and machines. And then, almost overnight, that dominance began to crumble. The reason? A sleek, silver-winged predator that roared through the heavens at 440 miles per hour, the P-51 Mustang. Before the Mustang's arrival, the air war in Europe was a brutal struggle of endurance and sacrifice. The U.S. 8th Air Force launched daylight bombing raids deep into German territory, believing that destroying the Reich's industrial heart could cripple its war machine. But without long-range fighter escorts, the bombers were vulnerable once they ventured beyond the protective range of Spitfires or Thunderbolts. The Luftwaffe, with its elite pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, would swoop down like falcons, tearing into the bomber formations. Sky after sky became a graveyard of burning metal and falling parachutes. Some missions saw entire bomber groups annihilated before reaching their targets. It was warfare at its most punishing, a test of courage and endurance, where every mile forward came with a terrible cost. The Luftwaffe had perfected a deadly formula. They waited until the bombers crossed into unescorted airspace, then attacked in coordinated waves. German fighters carried heavy cannons capable of ripping through the bomber's thick armor with a few well-placed bursts. In response, bomber crews huddled together in tight defensive formations, their 50 caliber guns blazing in every direction. But despite their bravery, the statistics were grim. Losses mounted so high that some commanders feared the strategic bombing campaign might have to be abandoned. Then came the P-51 Mustang, and with it, the end of Germany's air supremacy. When the Merlin-powered Mustangs joined the bomber streams, the entire dynamic of aerial warfare changed overnight. For the first time, the bombers were no longer flying into a trap. The P-51 had the range to escort them all the way to their targets, even as far as Berlin, and the performance to take on any German fighter that dared to challenge them. The German pilots, who once awaited the helpless bombers with grim anticipation, now found themselves being hunted. The Mustangs didn't just defend, they attacked. They dove into enemy formations with precision, using their speed and agility to break apart the Luftwaffe's carefully coordinated strikes. The tables had turned. The hunter had become the hunted. One of the Mustang's most devastating strengths was its endurance. Equipped with drop tanks, it could fly over 1,600 miles, far beyond the reach of any previous escort fighter. This meant that German pilots could no longer retreat safely to their bases once the bombers arrived. The Mustangs followed them home, strafing airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, and leaving the Luftwaffe no place to regroup. In just a few months, the Mustang transformed the skies from a deadly ambush zone into an Allied stronghold. The effect on German morale was immediate and profound. Veteran Luftwaffe aces, once confident in their superiority, found themselves overwhelmed by the Mustang's relentless presence. Dogfights that once tilted in Germany's favor now ended with smoking wrecks tumbling toward the earth. Many German pilots described the first encounters with Mustangs as shocking. They couldn't believe how fast and maneuverable the new American fighters were, or how long they could stay in the fight. Even the elite Jagdgeschwader units, once the pride of the Reich, began suffering unsustainable losses. But the Mustang's impact went beyond individual battles. It dismantled the Luftwaffe's entire operational system. Before its arrival, the Germans could rotate their squadrons, attack bombers with mass strength, and then retreat to refuel and rearm. The Mustang ended that cycle. No longer could German airfields serve as safe havens. P-51s ranged far and wide, diving low to destroy parked planes, fuel depots, and convoys. Every day, the Luftwaffe's resources bled away. Pilots, aircraft, and fuel all vanishing into the sky. The Mustang also exploited one of Germany's growing weaknesses, its lack of experienced pilots. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was facing a crisis of attrition. Years of combat had decimated its original cadre of skilled flyers, and replacements were arriving with only minimal training. Against the Mustang, that lack of experience was fatal. American pilots, by contrast, benefited from rigorous training and growing numerical superiority. With better aircraft, better tactics, and overwhelming support, they seized control of the skies. One of the most telling examples of the Mustang's dominance came during the lead-up to D-Day. In the months before the Allied invasion of Normandy, the Luftwaffe was tasked with defending the French coast and intercepting Allied reconnaissance and bombing missions. But by that time, the Mustang had already made the skies too dangerous for German operations. P-51s roamed across France, Belgium, and Western Germany, shooting down anything that dared take off. By June 6, 1944, the day of the invasion, the Luftwaffe was nearly powerless to intervene. Allied forces landed on the beaches under a canopy of friendly air cover, and the once fearsome German Air Force could only watch from a distance. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. Between early 1944 and the end of the war, Allied air forces destroyed thousands of German aircraft. Mustang pilots alone claimed nearly 5,000 kills in air-to-air combat, while thousands more were destroyed on the ground. In some regions, the Luftwaffe simply ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Entire squadrons were wiped out faster than Germany could replace them. The Reich's once glorious air arm, which had terrorized Europe at the war's outset, was reduced to scattered pockets of resistance. Even Germany's introduction of advanced aircraft, like the Me-262 jet fighter, could not reverse the tide. On paper, The Me-262 was revolutionary, the first operational jet in history faster than any piston engine plane. But it arrived too late, and the Mustangs knew how to deal with it. They patrolled near airfields, waiting for the jets to take off or land, when their engines were slow to respond. Dozens of Me-262s were destroyed before they ever reached combat speed. The Luftwaffe's final technological gamble was nullified before it could change the outcome. The Mustang's psychological effect was just as devastating as its physical one. For years, the Luftwaffe had fought with the confidence of a master. Their reputation, built from the Blitzkrieg campaigns and the Battle of Britain, made them seem invincible. But as Mustangs filled the skies, that aura vanished. German pilots began to fear the very sight of the aircraft. Its long nose, its polished metal gleam, its deadly silhouette slicing through the clouds. They knew that once a Mustang got behind them, escape was nearly impossible. For the Allied bomber crews, the change was miraculous. Where once they had flown through flak and fighters with dread in their hearts, they now felt a renewed sense of hope. They could see the silver Mustangs weaving in formation above and beside them, cutting through enemy attacks before they could form. The phrase "little friends," as the bomber crews affectionately called their escorts, became a symbol of trust and gratitude. Missions that once seemed suicidal now became survivable. The Mustang was more than a weapon. It was salvation in aluminum and firepower. Strategically, the Mustang allowed the Allies to do something they had never achieved before: destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground simultaneously. The Allied command understood that victory on the ground required mastery of the air. So, they unleashed the Mustang to systematically dismantle Germany's entire air defense network. Radar stations, fuel depots, train lines, and aircraft factories were all within range. By crippling the Luftwaffe's logistics, the Mustang didn't just win battles, it won the long war of attrition. As Germany's air force weakened, the Allies gained a critical advantage. Ground operations could proceed with fewer risks from enemy air attacks. Tanks rolled across France without fear of strafing. Supply convoys moved freely. Every success on the battlefield was built upon the foundation of air superiority, and that air superiority was secured by the Mustang. The Mustang's dominance also forced a profound tactical shift. The Luftwaffe could no longer engage the bombers on equal terms. Instead, they were forced to resort to desperate hit-and-run tactics, attacking from above and diving away, hoping to avoid the Mustang's reach. But even those attempts often ended in disaster. The Mustang's speed and high-altitude capability allowed it to climb after fleeing enemies, turning every retreat into a chase. The Luftwaffe's confidence, discipline, and coordination unraveled with each passing month. By late 1944, the transformation was complete. The once feared Luftwaffe had been broken. Its pilots were few, its fuel scarce, its aircraft grounded or destroyed. The Allied bombers now roamed over Germany's industrial centers with near impunity. The sky, once the pride of the Reich, now belonged to the Allies. The P-51 Mustang had not just defeated the Luftwaffe, it had dismantled the myth of German invincibility. It turned the tide of the air war, allowing the Allies to strike at the heart of Nazi power. It was proof that speed, range, and innovation could overcome years of dominance. With every sortie, the Mustang drove another nail into the Luftwaffe's coffin, until at last, the sky over Europe was no longer contested. The Mustang did what no other aircraft had done before it. It conquered the enemy's airspace, destroyed his confidence, and ensured that the Allies would never again fight under German skies. It was the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back. When we speak of victory in World War II, our minds often turn to great battles, powerful leaders, and acts of courage that defined an era. But beneath those stories of heroism lies another kind of triumph, one built not on the battlefield alone, but in the laboratories, factories, and design rooms where innovation took flight. The P-51 Mustang was one of those triumphs. It wasn't merely a machine of war. It was a living testament to Allied ingenuity, cooperation, and belief in progress. The Mustang represented something far greater than metal and speed. It embodied the idea that when free nations unite in purpose and creativity, they can achieve the impossible. At the height of the war, when the world was engulfed in chaos, the Mustang became a symbol of hope. Its sleek frame and unmistakable sound were not just signs of military strength, but of collective intelligence. Each rivet, each bolt, each curve of that aircraft carried the mark of countless individuals, engineers, machinists, pilots, and factory workers, who together created something extraordinary. It was, in every sense, a human achievement disguised as a mechanical one. The Mustang was born from a partnership that spanned oceans. Its design came from the drawing boards of North American Aviation, its heart from the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and its success from the unified determination of the Allies to outthink and outbuild their enemy. This collaboration was not accidental. It reflected the growing realization among the Allied powers that victory would depend not on one nation's strength, but on the synergy of many. The Mustang was living proof that unity in purpose could translate directly into dominance in the skies. When the P-51 entered service, it was more than a weapon. It was a message. It told the world that the Allies could innovate as fast as they could fight. It was a declaration of faith in technology, in human resourcefulness, and in cooperation. The Germans had their brilliant engineers too, men like Messerschmitt and Heinkel, who built remarkable aircraft. But the difference lay in how innovation was pursued. The Axis relied on secrecy, hierarchy, and centralized control. The Allies relied on shared ideas, flexible thinking, and the courage to experiment. That open exchange of knowledge, British experience, American production, and shared sacrifice created an aircraft that no single country could have built alone. In many ways, the Mustang became the physical embodiment of democracy's greatest strength, its ability to adapt and improve. It wasn't perfect at first. Its early models struggled at high altitudes, and its range was limited. But the Allies didn't discard it. They improved it. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the laminar flow wing design, the bubble canopy for better visibility, all these upgrades came through collaboration and constant refinement. Every version of the Mustang was better than the last. That relentless drive for improvement mirrored the spirit of the Allied war effort itself. The Mustang also symbolized the industrial might that defined America's role in the war. Factories across the United States worked around the clock, producing not just aircraft, but the tools of freedom. Assembly lines ran day and night, filled with men and women, many of them working such jobs for the first time, turning raw materials into instruments of liberation. Rosie the Riveter, standing proud with her rolled-up sleeve, became the face of that effort. Every Mustang that took off from an airfield carried within it the labor of thousands of unseen hands, each one doing their part to ensure that freedom would prevail. It is easy to marvel at the Mustang's sleek design, its long-range endurance, and its deadly firepower. But what made it truly special was its purpose. It wasn't built for conquest, it was built for protection. It was the guardian of the bomber crews who flew deep into enemy territory, the shield that made it possible for them to strike the heart of Nazi industry and return home alive. The P-51 didn't just win dogfights, it saved lives. That moral purpose, that dedication to defending rather than destroying indiscriminately, gave the aircraft a unique place in history. It wasn't simply a machine of war, it was a machine of liberation. As the war raged on, the Mustang became more than an aircraft. It became a legend. Pilots spoke of it with reverence, describing how it seemed to anticipate their every move. Its responsiveness, its balance, its agility, these were not just technical features, but extensions of the pilot's will. It became a symbol of mastery and freedom, of man and machine working in harmony. When squadrons of Mustangs escorted bombers across Europe, they did more than protect steel and ammunition. They carried with them the spirit of the Allied cause. Every gleaming fuselage that caught the sunlight reminded the world that tyranny could be challenged, that oppression could be outflown, and that freedom could move faster than fear. The Mustang also stood as proof of what could be achieved when imagination triumphed over limitation. The Allies faced overwhelming odds in the early years of the war. The Luftwaffe's blitzkrieg tactics, its advanced aircraft, and its elite pilots had given Germany dominance. But the Mustang showed that dominance could be undone not by desperation, but by design. It was a triumph not of numbers, but of ideas. A demonstration that intelligence, creativity, and cooperation were as potent as any weapon. In the grand sweep of history, the P-51's significance extends far beyond its victories in the air. It represented a turning point in how wars would be fought and won. Before the Mustang, air warfare was largely tactical, short-range, reactive, and confined. The Mustang introduced a new era of strategic air power. It allowed the Allies to project force deep into enemy territory, to strike where the enemy least expected, and to maintain control of the skies. This shift reshaped military thinking for generations to come. Long-range precision, speed, and endurance became the new hallmarks of victory, all lessons learned from the Mustang's success. Even after the war, the Mustang continued to serve as a symbol of resilience and adaptability. It flew in Korea, it inspired post-war jet designs, and it remained a beloved aircraft long after newer models replaced it. To this day, when one hears the distinctive roar of a Mustang's Merlin engine at an air show, it evokes a sense of awe, not just for what it was, but for what it represented. It is a sound that recalls an age when the free world stood together, when courage and cooperation rose against tyranny, and when innovation carried hope on its wings. The Mustang's legacy also lies in its people, the pilots who flew it and the engineers who built it. Men like Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, first learned to push the limits of flight in a Mustang. Many Allied aces credited the aircraft with giving them an edge that made survival possible. For them, the P-51 was more than a machine. It was a partner, a friend, and a lifeline. And for the ground crews who maintained it, each successful mission was proof that their work mattered, that every wrench turn and fuel line inspection was a small act of defiance against tyranny. The Mustang spirit, its unity of purpose, its perfection through partnership, became a metaphor for the Allied victory itself. The war was not won by one nation or one army alone. It was won through shared struggle and shared success. The Mustang reflected that same harmony. American industry, British innovation, and global cooperation combined to produce something that transcended national pride. It belonged to everyone who believed in the cause of freedom. In a way, the Mustang represented the best of humanity in the midst of its worst conflict. It was born of necessity, but it carried within it ideals that were far greater than war itself: creativity, unity, and the relentless pursuit of progress. It showed that when free minds work together, they can transform even the tools of destruction into symbols of hope. When we look back at the black and white photographs of those gleaming Mustangs lined up on airfields in England, their noses painted, their wings outstretched, we see more than warplanes. We see the embodiment of belief in teamwork, in innovation, and in victory through intellect. Those aircraft were more than instruments of combat. They were flying declarations of freedom. The Mustang cracked the Luftwaffe, yes, but it did more than that. It cracked the myth that tyranny was unbeatable. It proved that democracy's strength lay not just in numbers, but in imagination. That open collaboration could outmatch even the most disciplined dictatorship. Every flight over occupied Europe was a testament to that idea. The very sight of the Mustang soaring high above the clouds told soldiers and civilians alike that liberation was coming, that technology and teamwork had given wings to justice. The Mustang's legacy didn't end with the war. It continued to inspire generations of engineers, aviators, and dreamers. Its blend of beauty, efficiency, and effectiveness became a benchmark for design. Long after its last mission, it remains a symbol not of destruction, but of determination. In every polished surface and every roaring engine, there echoes the truth that progress is humanity's greatest weapon. When people today see a P-51 flying at an air show, they don't just see a warplane from another era. They see a story of ordinary people who achieved something extraordinary. A story of nations that chose to share rather than compete. A story of hope built in the shadow of despair. The Mustang reminds us that the victory of the free world was not inevitable. It was earned through ingenuity, unity, and belief in what could be achieved when people refused to give up. And so as the sound of that Merlin engine fades into the distance, it leaves behind a message that endures. Innovation wins wars, but cooperation builds peace. The Mustang was not just a tool of war, it was a triumph of spirit. It was, and remains, a 440-mile-per-hour symbol of how human creativity, when guided by purpose and shared resolve, can conquer even the darkest skies.